We haven't yet started this meeting.
Huh? All right. Hello? All hear me? All right, sorry, very sorry about that. There was some confusion on my end of things, but I will begin and hopefully we'll make it worth your while that you waited. All right, so what I'd like to do over the next 4 weeks is, first of all, hello, good to see all of you. What I'd like to do over the next 4 weeks is really sort of take a look at not just Polish history, but to some extent how we as Jews tend to view Polish history or tend to view Poland or Poles or Polish-Jewish relations. Because again, it's a long and complex history, and one which I think is often the case with long and complex histories is sort of victim to a lot of mythology, and so I'm happy. Anybody who wishes to ask questions along the way, feel free to do so. Just speak, interrupt me, all well and good. I'm normally a high school teacher, so I'm accustomed to anything you may end up doing. So it's always good when you start anything. It's useful to, define terms. And so, when we say Pole, when we say Poland, right, understand that that's a term that means a variety of things in times, right, until the 19th century, right, for example, in let's say the 1700s, a fairly important time in Polish history, the term Pole was generally applied only to nobles, right, when people spoke of the virtues of the qualities of, right, the Polish people, right, if you were a Polish nobleman, you wouldn't be using that term to apply to peasants. And the Polish nobility is actually fairly expansive.
You got it. Good, thank you.
Yeah, the Polish nobility is fairly expansive. Something like 12% of the population, perhaps, is made up of what was first as the Szlachta, the Polish nobility, and that's how the term generally came to be used. Now, again, as time goes on, eventually nationalism comes in, and that comes to be much more broad, right? But that's more of a 19th century phenomenon. And Poland itself was, until the end of World War II, a sort of multinational concept, right? And you can look here at a map of Poland at its height and see the areas that were incorporated and included in what constituted Poland at the height of what was called the Commonwealth. All right, of the of Poland, and you can see there were over half a dozen different. There were Germans and Poles, Ukrainians who were called different things there, various Slavs, Lithuanians. There are groups that don't appear here: Tatars and Karaites and Jews. Right, lots of different groups of people living in Poland. None of whom, even in sort of modern terminology, would be. And certainly a large number of these people were Jews. And it's worth pointing out here, right, by the late 18th century, at the time of the Polish partitions, not only were Jews a significant part of the population of Poland, and a growing part, all right, but we might discuss later, but globally, Polish Jewry was perhaps a third of the global Jewish population. And this is one of those things where, we don't have hard and fast details on this. Up until, let's say, through the Middle Ages, Jews living in the Muslim world were a majority of the Jewish population. Probably by about 1600, roughly the populations had sort of reached equality, right? Jews living in Christian Europe for the most part, and Jews living in the Muslim world more or less even. And then in the 1600s and 1700s, and certainly in the 1800s, the Ashkenazi population skyrockets, particularly the Polish population, which again is, Ukrainian Jewry, Belarusian Jewry, Lithuanian Jewry, Polish Jewry. The general feeling here is it's a combination of low marriage ages, right? I mean, there are accounts of Jews marrying, 12, 13, and very low child mortality. So it's not necessarily that more Jews are being born, but more Jews were surviving. So population skyrockets. So, when you think about that, it's interesting. The vast majority of Ashkenazim have at least some descendant of Polish Jewry, right? And again, you guys, if you want to do a show of hands, if not, but I'm looking around seeing, mostly Ashkenazim here. Chances are pretty good that you have Polish Jewish ancestors. When I say Polish, understand if your family came from Ukraine, that was Polish Jewry. If your family were Litvaks, that was Polish Jewry. Not in the terms of Jewish geography, right? We had our own terms, but in terms of the geography of, right, what was the Polish state at its height in the mid-17th century. It's quite possible that most Jews in the world today are at least partially descended from Polish Jewry. Right? So this is a pretty significant element in the Jewish population today. And look, we don't have to go through all the details, but you all have, I'm sure, your folk history, your family histories. Jews have a tendency to sort of keep kind of our hierarchy or track of, of who's good for the Jews, who's bad for the Jews, right? Some nationalities come out well, some come out poorly. I think for the most part,
The Fishbrook.
sorry, for most, somebody saying something? For the most part, with most Ashkenazim, I think, there is a sense that the Poles were bad for the Jews, that Poland bad for the Jews. You had, not too long ago, I think it was the Israeli foreign minister made the fairly undiplomatic remark that, to the extent that Poles, sort of, suckled anti-Semitism in their mother's milk and so forth. So, and this is, again, I think a pretty common attitude one finds, we'll talk about Polish Jewry. It's been asked for people to mute unless you're saying something. So I'd say personally, as long as you're not making, too much extraneous noise, I like when people aren't muted, because then I get a sense that these people are still alive and, attentive, but, whatever works for you. So understand, for a long time, Poland was actually seen as a particularly good place for Jews, right? It's not an accident that Poland develops this huge Jewish population, right? Develops a huge Jewish population because a lot of Jews had migrated there, and because conditions in Poland, not just, health conditions, but, let's say political conditions, made it a place where Jews weren't leaving, right? For a long time, Poland was a place that drew Jewish migrants. And there's a 17th century expression, Poland is heaven for the nobility, purgatory for townspeople, hell for peasants, and paradise for Jews. A description, right, which I think a lot of people who think they know something about Polish Jewish history would find quite surprising. And it's a fascinating expression for a number of reasons, right? So let's look at this again, right? What lessons, right, implicit or explicit, might one draw from this, right? What questions might one ask about this? And again, I'll guide it because this is one of those teacher questions where like there's a million proper answers. So one, let's say, who is missing from this list? Not a rhetorical, if somebody wants to try and give an answer. Right? How about this? Anybody notice that one of these groups is different from the others? And it goes back to what I said before about the meaning of the word Pole.
Christians?
Okay. Well, Christians, but also Poles, right? Meaning that which again, virtually all Poles have been Christians, right? That we have to understand, and if you took my classes earlier, I mentioned this before, the pre-modern world was not a world, for the most part, divided by nationalities. It was divided by social classes or corporations based on a variety of things. And you see four of those things here, right? The nobles, right, in France they call them estates, was a category of people. Townspeople, right, who had specific rights in towns, a category of people. Peasants, another category. Jews, another category, right? Meaning the Poles were not there. That term wouldn't have been used at the time. So when we think about the place of Jews in this world, it's important to understand this was certainly in an extremely Christian society. It was a place where Jews stood out by virtue of being Jews. But it's not the kind of nationalist society that we're going to find sort of in 20th century Poland, where Polish nationalism becomes extremely intense, right? Jews fit in a certain way. And the next question, right, and we'll look at how they fit in, is based on this list, right, who had it good in Poland, and what does that suggest, right? Well, peasants, as a rule, not good. Townspeople, it's not heaven, but it's not hell either. Two groups of people, two very seemingly disparate groups of people, seem to be standing out in Poland, right? The nobility and the Jews. And anybody take a guess why those groups, or what does it suggest that those groups are, right, the ones who are living large in Poland? Well, here's the thing, right? What did Jews do in Poland? Anybody know? Not that's
money
totally fine. I am the team. Well, for whom?
to the nobles.
Ah, okay. The Jews made money for themselves, and the Jews made money for the nobles. All right. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. But yeah, Jews had a extremely symbiotic relationship with the Polish nobility. Right, and we'll talk about what that means in greater detail, but it's important for understanding. And again, let's go back to this statement here. When we say, let's say, that Poland in the 17th century was a paradise for Jews, that's not because the Poles loved the Jews, right? Or that the Poles, respected Jews or enjoyed their presence, whatever it would be. It's because they had a special relationship with a particular class of very powerful people. But, you find this a lot in Jewish history, right? Jews in a lot of these societies are going to benefit from their relationships with a particular elite, right? The problem, of course, is that those elites generally don't represent the majority of the population. And in periods of social unrest and periods of revolution, uprising, things like that, it's not at all uncommon for Jews to be sort of on the receiving end, not just of anti-Jewish anger, but of anger directed against those elites, right? Because their place in that society is highly dependent upon that relationship. And when things go bad for those elites, things may also go bad for the Jews. Certainly Jews in Poland did not see themselves as a people living in a bad place, right? And in fact, when you look at the legends that Jews develop, and some of which are shared by non-Jews in Poland, you can see, a place where Jews felt that they had this kind of unique and blessed place, right? You have these stories that were shared by both Christians and Jews, that King Casimir the Great, who was one of the kings who invited Jews in the Middle Ages, had a Jewish mistress, Estherka, with whom he had 4 children, 2 boys who were raised as Christians, 2 girls who were raised as Jews, which by itself is a significant thing, right? You might have had these kinds of legends in other places, but the kids all would have been raised as Christians, right? So there's almost like in this myth a kind of sharing here. By the way, it's an interesting painting here. If you want to look at this, is obviously a painting Christian of Casimir coming to visit Estherka. Anybody notice anything interesting or wrong about the sort of Jewish presentation in this picture? The sorry, the mezuzahs on the right side of the board.
You know, outside.
Yeah, right. So it's an interesting thing. Obviously, clearly, Polish painter who understood the Jews have these things, but didn't quite get all the details down. Polish Jews had their own sort of legend about Poland, that when they arrived, they misunderstood Poland, right, and took it to mean in Hebrew Polin, like remain here, right? This idea that the Jews received this kind of almost divine guidance that this is a place for them to stay, and there even was a legend in the 16th century of this guy Saul Wall, who was king for a day of Poland, right? Where there was this sort of dynastic dispute as to who should rule, and there was this one wise sort of respected Jew who, in the midst of this conflict, when they couldn't decide who should rule, they said, you know what? Let's make this Jew the king until this can be resolved. And it's a Jewish myth, right? But when you look at myths like that, right, what are the Jews also saying, though, about at least the Polish nobility, right? That these were people who could, even if they were not, say, Philo-Semites, who could see at least some Jews as worthwhile, as noble, as virtuous, as people who can trust with responsibility. We have here an account from the late 16th century by a Italian papal emissary to Poland, right? And these principalities, one still comes upon masses of Jews who are not sustained as much as in some other lands. They do not live here under pitiful conditions and do not engage in lowly pursuits, but rather they possess land, engage in commerce, devote themselves to study, especially medicine and astrology. They possess considerable wealth and they dwell not only among respectable citizens, but occasionally even dominate them. There are no special marks that distinguish them. They're even permitted to wear the sword and go about armed. In general, they enjoy equal rights. Which, again, is if you know things about what's going on in other Christian countries at this time, a fascinating account of things. So if you look at the Cardinal's account, it points to two really important things about what made Poland such a good place for Jews. One is that Poland was economically a land of opportunity. You know, basically, here is the structure of Poland. You have this enormous peasant population, right? 90% of the population. You have this significant noble class, right? 10 to 12% of the population. And just to give you some sense of perspective there, I think that in France, the nobles were like 2% of the population, right? So this
Not right now.
right.
Stephanie and
So
Simon Bergson.
The reason why these peasant
Helene and Barry Lewis. Judy Friedman and Ron Goldstock in honor of Hyatt. Jonathan Burstall.
So that would be the kind of thing which could probably be muted.
Cynthia and Jeffrey Weisenfeld. And
Whoever is doing that, probably ideally
please welcome
could mute that. Is that a personal?
I think you can mute everybody if you want to, David.
Yes,
you can
I think I should do that. Yes, all right. All right, sorry, it's been a while since we had to do this. Let me.
Like a whole bunch of Jews
No, I can't. Oh wait, claim host. No, what I can't because I am not officially the host. So I actually don't have the ability to mute people. So I'm going to ask again, right? Those of you who are making that noise, there we go. All right. Okay. So the nobles bring in Jews precisely to sort of serve the rural community, right? Do the things peasants don't do, but also to monetize their estates, right? So if I'm a noble, I might own a giant forest. That forest represents potential wealth. The Jews turn that into real wealth, right? Because I might lease that forest to a Jew for a fee, and that Jew is going to see to chopping down that lumber with Jewish lumberjacks and shipping that stuff on Jewish riverboats, right, and selling it with a Jewish merchant, right? I might control the bridges on a river. I'm not going to go around and collect tolls. I'm going to lease that out to a Jew to collect the tolls, right? And very important, Jews had generally the monopolies on distilling and selling alcohol. Certainly beer in the more prestigious, sort of nobles, hard alcohol as well, which is extraordinarily lucrative. So Jews flocked to Poland because Poland is a place where Jews were protected from persecution and could make a lot of money. And Jews enjoyed a tremendous level of autonomy. And again, this was sort of, the norm in the Middle Ages, but the Jews enjoyed a degree of autonomy, probably not seen since Babel, maybe Spain, where you had not only individual autonomous Jewish authorities in each town, but you had something called the Vod of the Four Lands, which, like Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, Volhynia, Galicia maybe, right, where a couple times a year, right, Jews would assemble leadership of all the different towns in this sort of bicameral assembly to make decisions, right, for the entire Jewish community. So this is a place where Jews sort of were enjoying the good life. Given the role Jews played in this service economy, we need to understand that, there was lots of contact between Jews and non. We often have this idea of like the Jews living in their own area, the Christians living in their area. But, understand, right, the Jews' whole sort of place in this society involves interacting with non-Jews. I mean, some more than others, right? If I'm a merchant in a market town, right, my trade is buying and selling with non-Jews. Right, if I'm a tavern keeper, right, my business is, right, serving liquor to non-Jewish customers, right? If I'm a drayman, if I'm any number of things Jews are doing involves them with a non-Jewish clientele. Part of the 19th century, we don't necessarily have a lot of information about this. Again, there's not necessarily a lot written about, there's not a lot of Polish literature in general, but there are a few things that, again, we can sort of draw from what we do know. And it's very important to keep in mind that, look, we as Jews have a tendency to focus on how they think about us, right? And they don't think very highly of us. But it's really important, again, for reasons which will be made, perhaps more clear later on if they're not clear yet, how Jews thought about Christians. And as a rule, right, Jews tended to look down on Christians in the same way that Christians tended to look down on Jews. Right? Monotheists in general are fairly intolerant. Both Jews and Christians saw themselves as chosen people of the one true God, right? Each one claiming a unique divine covenant, viewing the other as in some ways corrupt or inferior. One interesting way to distinguish this view, though, is this. Jews understood that although they might be superior to Christians, God had ordained that they should be living in a position of inferiority, right? So certainly when Jews were confronted by reminders of their inferiority, they might petition the government, they might complain, they might protest, they might get things overturned, right? But they understood on some level that acts of sort of subjugation and subordination were part of God's plan. For Christians, it was the opposite, right? When Christians perceive themselves as being subordinated to Jews, that's going to strike some of them not as part of God's plan, but as an inversion of God's plan, right? An overturning of the natural order. So you have two groups of people who work together, who trade together, who do all kinds of things together. Both view the other as inferiors. Both have a sense of how they should interact with one another, what the nature of those relationships should be. And not uncommonly, that's not how those relations turn out. And given the size of the Jewish population, right, if you talk about, let's say by the 1780s or so, 750,000 Jews in a population of several million Poles, more than several million, probably like about 12 million Poles or so, or other Polish subjects, not necessarily Poles. Understand there's a lot of different types of encounters, right? We have this tendency, not just we as Jews, but people have a tendency to sort of talk in these big terms, like Jewish-Black relations, Jewish-Pole relations, right? Irish-English relations, right? Whatever it may be, right? And put these big stamps in it. But of course, under all of those big sort of categories, there are limitless individual contexts, right? Right. There are going to be relations that are hostile and intimate, respect and distrust, and a number of dichotomies exist in the same person, right? The same guy, and I always find it interesting, and we always make fun of it when people say things like, oh, well, I'm not a racist, and my best friend is Black or something like that. Well, the fact is, I don't think, let's say, best friend is really going to be the case, but humans have wonderful capacities to compartmentalize. And the reality is, it's not at all unusual for people to be in a position where, look, they don't like Jews, but this Jew is okay because he, right, doesn't have the same characteristics as those other Jews, right? Of course, we don't care for the Goyim, but look, the guy I work with, he's a nice guy. He means well, right? He's okay, right? Lots of people have these. The same individual can be simultaneously anti-Jewish in many circumstances and very favorable to certain Jews and others, right? The nature of things. One sort of fun little tidbit here in terms of clothing, and it also tells you something about the place of Jews in the society. Jews in 17th century and 18th century Poland tended to dress with clothes that aped the clothing of the nobility. Right, with one important distinction, even before the rise of Hasidus, they tended to wear more muted colors, right? The Polish nobility was known for wearing these sort of elaborate, sort of influenced by Turkish and Middle Eastern clothes. There's a fashion thing. You see here is a Polish nobleman, let's say in the 1600s. You don't have to take too much imagination to see that style of dress mirrored in Hasidic garb, right? The garb of the Hasidim, when they began, weren't them adopting new clothing. The real change comes in the 18th century, let's say, when the Hasidim don't change their manner of clothing, right? And the Hasidic movement, for reasons I won't go into now, like, again, developed certain sort of Kabbalistic explanations for their clothes and why they wear them. But originally, they were just sort of, again, mirroring the clothes worn by the nobles, which, again, tells you how the Jews themselves identified, right? They were very happy to wear those clothes, which symbolize their status. So what goes wrong? Right, so a couple of things. One is, let's go back to that statement there as noted, heaven for the nobility, paradise for Jews. When things go bad for the nobility, because things go bad for Poland, things will go bad for the Jews as well, which connects me to the second point. And if you are ever, for some bizarre reason, a student of mine in high school, maybe some sort of weird Freaky Friday thing where you switch identities with, grandchild or something like that. You'll hear me saying this a lot. Very important lesson for understanding Jewish history. When it rains, Jews get wet, right? Brilliant statement. I made it up. That a lot of times we have a tendency to, traditional Jewish historiography tended to focus on the Jews. What's happening to the Jews? And say, oh, well, this was good for the Jews, right? He must love the Jews. This is bad for the Jews. He must hate the Jews. Not uncommonly, the place of Jews in any given society depends heavily still on what's going on in that society, right? When there's a depression that hits, right, Jews are affected not because, right, some economists decided to screw the Jews, but because the economy goes south for everybody, right? Some policies certainly are specifically directed at Jews, but very often Jews are going to benefit from the same things that benefit other people, more or less, and they're going to suffer from the same things that cause other people to suffer, more or less. And in 1648, Poland suffers. And we, again, right, we view this in Jewish terms, right? What happens in 1648, right? Somebody want to give that answer? Nobody knows? Nobody wants to say? No problem.
Khmelnytsky.
Yeah, 1648, the Cossack Uprising, right? Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which Jews refer to as the Churban, right? The destruction, right? The same language used to refer to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And we see this quite reasonably as a dark day in Jewish history, a dark time in Jewish history. But interesting thing, right? Why did the Cossacks rebel? Who did they rebel against? They didn't rebel against the Jews.
The Schlachter.
Okay. Yeah, well, look, when we look at that map before, we see that Poland extended into much of what is today Ukraine. Okay. And understand Polish mythology in the same way that we have our mythology, the Poles have theirs. Polish mythology views the old kingdom, or what was by that point called a Commonwealth. Right, it was a republic, but a republic in which an elected king was the president, basically. So again, terminology is a little confusing. So Polish mythology holds that the old Commonwealth was a model of tolerance. Like, oh, look, we had Jews and Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Tatars and Karaites and Germans, and everybody was happy. Well, as is often the case, as I think we see in the United States now with, things like Black Lives Matters, the majority, the people in power, often have a completely sort of skewed view, let's say, of what the people they're ruling over think about how tolerant they are. So, it's an interesting thing. The Poles who are Catholics, the Szlachta, put a lot of pressure on Ukrainians to convert to a particular church called the Uniate Church, which is created for this purpose, still exists, in which the ceremonies and rituals were Eastern Orthodox, but it was under the authority of the Catholic Church. Right, and it's a funny thing. Again, the way this often works, Jews were treated better by Catholic Poles, let's say, than Orthodox Christians were, because the Jews, they had a specific place. The Orthodox Christians were just heretics, right? So the Polish regime is persecuting the Ukrainians. And we go back, and the Cossacks, if you want to, anybody wants to stay later, I can explain what Cossacks are in more detail, but if I have time, I can wait and do it. The Cossacks who lived in Ukraine saw themselves and their church under attack, and understand what we said before about the relationship to Jews and the Szlachta. The Szlachta are the ones making the rules, right? The nobles. But very commonly, the face of those rules, the face of that regime is Jewish, right? When a Ukrainian Cossack is paying a toll, it's to a Jew. When the taxes are collected, it's a Jewish tax collector. When the church has to borrow money, right, or pay whatever it is, it's going to a Jew, right? And that Jew is then again paying to the Polish nobles, but the face of it are the Jews. So when this uprising begins, in the beginning in particular, the targets tend to be Jews. And some of that is obviously just the general religious hostility, but a lot of that is attacking Jews as agents of the Polish state. And you have two histories, right? The Jews see this as a disaster for the Jews. The Poles see this as a disaster for Poland, right? Because eventually this uprising spills into Poland, and, it's a disaster for them as well. And you actually have these circumstances where, where again, certainly lots of Jews were killed. The early estimates were greatly inflated. The figures now say maybe 20,000 Jews were killed during this period of violence. But you have episodes where Jews were allowed to convert to Orthodoxy and save their lives, whereas Catholics taken prisoner were just killed outright because of, again, this weird different status there. Now, what's particularly destructive for Poland and consequently for Polish Jewry is that this uprising is not the end, it's the beginning, right? For the next century plus, Poland, for various reasons, finds itself increasingly subject to internal chaos, to foreign invasion. It's unable to defend itself from these rising great powers on its borders. And again, if anybody want to ever discuss Polish government, we can do that. But in the late 18th century, Poland is dissolved. Right, you have what are called the partitions of Poland, where the Austrians, Russians, and Prussians gobble up Poland, and Poland disappears. So what does this mean for the Jews? Well, one understand is that although, again, Poland is a big place, and there are places that are good economically and bad economically through this century of decline, Poland is increasingly unable to right itself. And what this means is that if the Polish state is in chaos, that also means that the Jewish authorities who depended on the Polish state are in chaos as well. And it's interesting to look. This is the same period, right, the 18th century, mid-18th century, that sees the rise of the Hasidic movement. And it's, interesting to think what might have happened a century earlier, right? If the Hasidic movement, which was very much opposed by a lot of halachic authorities in Poland at the time, had been trying to rise at a time where the Kahilas were stronger, they might have quashed it, right? Don't know. But certainly the Hasidic movement, which soon became the dominant movement in Poland, right, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, everything except for Lithuania, certainly benefited from this sort of chaos. Jews, like their Polish neighbors, find themselves divided under three very different regimes, and their fates will differ from there to there. And what this means is that Polish Jewry now has to really negotiate a lot of complex identities and political systems, and understand how that, breaks up sometimes, right? When you have uprisings in Poland in 1830 and 1863 and the 1790s, right, Poles who don't join, and most Poles didn't join, might just be viewed as people who are not sufficiently patriotic yet, right? Well, we've got to do more to bring the peasants in. Jews, by contrast, might be viewed as suspects, as people who, maybe can never be truly Polish, right? Maybe they're too loyal to the Russians, right? Maybe they don't belong here, right? Certainly there were Jews who were very enthusiastic about Polishness and about Poland. In 1784, Barak Yaselevitz organizes a Jewish cavalry regiment to fight on behalf of the Poles in the Kosciuszko Uprising. Fascinating guy. He spends the next 20 years or so organizing and fighting in various Polish units with Napoleon and so forth. He's killed in battle in 1809. His son, Yosel Berkowitz, and it's interesting looking at the names, right, how that plays out, the patronymics, also organizes a Jewish cavalry unit in the Polish Uprising in 1830. So there were certainly Jews who saw themselves as Poles and wanted to fight for Poland. But it's probably fair to say that for a lot of Jews, the new regimes brought benefits, right? And we can look at this, certainly in the case of Russian rule. We have a tendency to view Russian rule as very anti-Jewish, right? But at least initially, for many decades, Jews probably benefited from this, right? The Russians don't know what to do with the Jews. They don't have any Jews in Russia itself. They tend to leave the Jews alone, and the Jews prove extremely sort of useful to them, right? The Russians are, sort of moving large numbers of troops into these border areas, and those troops need to be provisioned. They need boots, they need tools, they need uniforms, all the things that Jews provided. So for a lot of Jews, right, they're doing pretty well precisely because of the relationships they developed with the Russian regime. Very much like what they developed with the Polish regime, right? I mean, Jews, look, not stupid, right? They see that the power is shifting. Nothing wrong with that, but understand how that's going to appear to some Polish patriots, right? That now the Jews are, working hand in hand with the enemies and so forth. And look, even when you look at Yaselevitz, there's an interesting little Polish folk song about him. It's very telling, right? One of the lines is, "This was Barak, famous Jew, man of duty, righteous Pole, not with drink, not with swindle," in Polish, as in Yiddish, shachar machar, "but with blood he paid for glory." So understand, it's an interesting thing here, right? And it's the sort of thing we see with a lot of minorities, right, in America or anywhere else, right? Barak, he's the good Jew, right? But there's an implication here. He's a good Jew precisely because he's not like those other Jews, right? Because he wins glory not with drink, like the Jewish tavern keeper, not with swindle, right, the shifty Jewish merchant, but with blood he paid for glory. So, I love this little line here because it really captures the kind of complexity and difficulty the Jews are facing here, right? Yes, there are Jews who can be accepted, Jews who are accepted, right? And certainly Poles who want to embrace Jews, but, what kind of Jews will they embrace and what do Jews have to do? In fact, the 19th century sees a rapid expansion of the Polish Jewish population, both Galicia, which was Austrian, and in Russian Poland. And understand this, most Jews were urban, And in these areas, most of the urban population was Jewish. This is going to be really important for our class in a couple of weeks when we talk, or next week, I guess, we talk about Jews in interwar Poland. Urban was a very broad term, right? 600 people in a little Jewish shtetl could be urban. 600,000 people in Warsaw could be urban, right? In the little towns, Jews were the overwhelming part of the population, which shtetl is basically a Jewish town. But even in larger towns, Jews generally were, if not a majority, at least a significant part of the population. Jews were nearly 40% of Warsaw, and Lodz probably over 50%, again, another big industrial town. Which also, I think, is interesting when we think about how we perceive Jews in Poland, right? We tend to think of Jews not just as a minority, but our own mythology is a minority that lives in fear. Right? The Jews are always victims. The Jews are always being attacked. All right. The fact is, though, that in a lot of these Polish towns where Jews are a majority, I don't think the Jews were walking around living in fear. Right? If you're 80% of the population, if you're even 30% of the population in your area, right? You're not quaking in your boots because some Pole walks by. Especially again because understand before the partitions, Jews certainly did not have to quake before a peasant in most cases, right? I'm the Lord's Jew, right? And afterwards, right, particularly in Russian Poland, where the Russians are often repressing the Poles, being a Jew wasn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, being a Jew in a big Jewish town, you were not necessarily going to be viewed as more suspect by the Russian authorities than Polish Catholics were. And again, there are going to be variations. Jews living in small villages had to probably be a little more circumspect. But a lot of Jews certainly were not walking around thinking themselves as being a people who were right living in fear of the Polish majority. There's a lot of inconsistency in Russian rule. You know, again, there are lots of efforts made, for example, to curtail Jewish tavern keeping. But again, Russian rule is often incompetent. It's often, extremely inefficient. You often have, as is the case in bad bureaucracies, multiple officials that people can appeal to. So when we look at what's happening, the lead up to this in the 19th century, we can look and say, oh, the Russians are making laws that are designed to eliminate or curtail rural Jewish tavern keeping. That's anti-Jewish. Well, certainly it's anti-Jewish, but did the Jews necessarily see themselves as in a hostile environment, right? Jews are very accustomed to having to negotiate a lot of things and bribe and find favor with one group or another. The fact is, many Jews continue to run taverns, find loopholes, hire non-Jews to serve as their public face, for instance, and so forth. And again, in terms of what this means for the place in Jewish society, well, there are a lot of people who didn't like the Jewish tavern keeper. Probably a lot of Poles were very happy to have a Jewish tavern keeper who they could buy their good Jewish vodka from, right? So does this relationship mean that the Jews are in danger? Does it mean that they are threatened? Does it mean that they're beloved, or does it mean something in between? And I would say that it's sort of all of those things and something in between or so. Even when we think about pogroms, right, the fact is the Polish parts, right, where Poles actually lived, were not particularly known for pogroms in the 19th century. Right, and in Russia in general, not until 1881 was it particularly violent, but even in 1881, when the pogroms break out in March for the eastern Ukraine, the Poles for many months thought, oh, well, what do you expect from the Ukrainians? Right? They're a bunch of primitives, not like us Poles who are more sophisticated. And when the first pogroms broke out in Warsaw in December of 1881, there was this sort of real soul searching on the part of Polish liberals and intellectuals. Like, how did this happen? Where did we go wrong? Right, because they and perhaps even Jews didn't see Poland as the kind of place where this was likely to happen. So if all this is true, right, then what did go wrong? So I would say that understand the 19th century is really sort of a critical time here. And again, it's important to understand, as I said, when it rains, Jews get wet. This is the age of nationalism. And nationalism takes many forms, but certainly one form it takes is one which is very hostile to the other, whatever form that hostility takes. There were lots of Polish liberal nationalists in the 19th century. In fact, I'd say that the general tone of Polish nationalism until the 1880s tended to be fairly liberal towards Jews. All right, and in general, nationalisms in the 19th century often, right, liberal nationalists viewed the Jewish question as one which was, important. But it was generally based on the premise that Jews would Polonize, whatever exactly that meant, right? Meaning that you had lots of leading intellectual figures in Poland in the 19th century saying that Poland needed to embrace its Jews. But the flip side was that Jews needed to embrace Poland, right? They didn't need to stop being Jews, but they needed to learn Polish. They needed to embrace a Polish identity, perhaps change their outfits, right? Shave their beards, whatever it may be. And, relatively few Jews, of course, are going to find that appealing. Certainly there were Polonized Jews. But, the opposite of that, of course, is that, well, a lot of Polish nationalists are going to start to get resentful at, how that acts. For those of you who say, well, this is anti-Semitism.
To hear this message in English, press 1.
What's that? What's that? Yeah, well, good. Normally I'd be upset by that, but it actually is telling because it fits in with what I'm saying. You could use that now if you could.
2, 3,
That understand, we
3,
tend to,
1.
whoever is doing that, if they could mute
Regarding pickup times for
their,
Tuesday, September
okay, look,
1st.
it does illustrate my point, which is that we tend to view this sort of thing as like, oh, those people are anti-Semites, right? They want Jews to learn Polish, right? But think about America today and how some people react to
Probably Helen Cooper.
exactly what we're hearing in this unmuted telephone conversation, right? A lot of people feel like, why should we learn Spanish? Why should we give people the option, right?
If you have any questions,
people need to learn English. So yeah, of course it's bigoted, but it's a bigotry that, we should understand because it's a bigotry that many of us share today, right? And in general, understand the growth of all forms of nationalism heightened tensions, right? An earlier period could have viewed Jews and peasants and nobles and all these different things, but you now have, right, this growing idea of it's the Jews versus the Poles, right? That these and again, this will be very important for later on, the Jews versus the Poles, but what about the Russians? What about the Germans? What about the Ukrainians? All of these threaten the existence of the Polish nation, and that's very important, right? We see the Poles as the dominant majority. The Poles didn't see themselves that way, right? In the context of 19th century nationalism, the Poles are the ones who saw themselves as the victims of great power violence, who had seen their patrimony stolen from them, who were prohibited from passing their culture and identity onto their children, right? In at least 2 of the 3 Polands, there were strict backlashes against Polish language schools and so forth. And saw themselves as the ones desperately trying to liberate themselves, and increasingly, right, are going to start looking at people like the Jews and saying, well, look, you got to choose. You're either with us or against us. Being with us means Polonizing, means joining us in our militias and so forth. And if you're against us, well, then you're against us. So, look, by the late 1800s, these tensions are increasing. Poland, even in the late 1800s, was still a better place for Jews in the Russian Empire than other parts of the Russian Empire. Again, complicated stuff. Russia had different sets of laws for different places. So Jews in Poland suffered.
Could you turn your volume up? I can't hear you.
Okay. So Jews in Russian Poland suffered fewer restrictions than Jews in other parts of the Russian Empire. So much so that you have a influx of Jews in the late 19th century from other parts of the Russian Empire into Kingdom Poland. A lot of Litvaks, a lot of other people from Belarus and Ukraine, which also, from the perspective of Poles, gave them the impression that, hey, not only are Jews flooding into Poland and taking jobs from us, but Russified Jews,
right? And a lot of them weren't particularly Russified unless they're a Polish peasant, right? Meaning, to the perspective of Poles, these Jews coming from the East were Russified. Most of these Jews were still Yiddish speaking, but perception trumps reality, right? So in the late 19th century, there's this view of, right, Jews sort of flooding in, but not just Jews, but Jews serving as agents of the Russian government, of Russian culture. And this is, of course, the same time that political anti-Semitism in general is developing, right? The 1870s was the age of sort of the growth of political anti-Semitism as a political movement. So in this sense, the changes that are really taking place in Poland are not unique to Poland, right? It's part of this larger sort of continental-wide growth of anti-Semitism. And by the beginning of the 20th century, Polish nationalism, which was very, very strong, had taken two basic turns, and we'll sort of begin with this next week. You had Josip Pilsudski, who is a socialist, but a very sort of moderate socialist, who looked towards creating a large Poland or Great Poland with national minorities, with minority rights, but who viewed the Jews as a religious minority, not a national minority, and certainly was friendly enough to Jews. Again, he was not an anti-Semite, as the term would be used, but he expected Jews to Polonize and become a Western-style Poles of the Mosaic faith. So open to Jews, but again, wanted them to make certain changes. More problematic was the right wing, Roman Dmowski's National Democrats, which had a big appeal to the peasants, who wanted a smaller, more Polish Poland, and one which would have no place for Jews. And so by the time we get to the Great War, right, these two figures have already developed mass followings in Poland, and we'll pick up with that next week. And I'm happy now to, again, answer any questions or discuss anything. And again, I apologize for the delay today. My mistake entirely. If there are no questions, nobody wants to be that kid who raises his hand when the teacher says you can leave. So if there are no questions, I'm happy to dismiss you. And
I have a question.
Yes.
So in all of this, of course, the majority of the ethnic Poles, or what came to be viewed as ethnic Poles, were, of course, as you said, overwhelmingly Catholic. So what about the way the Polish Catholic Church viewed the Jews during this period?
So good question. And look, it's particularly in Poland, not particularly in Poland, you find this in other countries as well. Polish Catholicism so first of all, there's the traditional Christian animus towards Jews, right? So right off the bat, we can say that yes, the Catholic Church viewed the Jews problematically, right? Simply because the Jews should convert. But keep in mind as well, traditional Catholic view of Jews is that they are to be inferior, but they have a right to live and perform certain functions and so forth. So, we can say that Catholic ideology is that Jews should be inferior, should be reminded of their inferiority, but certainly have a right to live unmolested. But because of what's happening, particularly with Orthodoxy in the Russian Empire, and with Lutheranism in Germany. Galicia is different because Galicia was under the control of the Austrians, who are also Catholics. And so Polish Catholicism in Galicia didn't have the same kind of tension there, although there were some tensions with the Ukrainians in the East. Polish Catholicism becomes very much intertwined with Polish nationalism, right? That defense of Polishness and defense of Catholicism are intertwined, right? So, you could say that in theory, the Catholic Church could be like a neutral arbiter, right? This is a religious issue, this is a national issue. But Catholic Church in Poland doesn't work that way. So it is also at the same time becoming sort of a bastion of this kind of like Dmowski's right-wing anti-Jewish sentiment, right? Especially because, again, Dmowski is more traditional. Pilsudski is a socialist, and this ties into this stuff too, right? Pilsudski is not a religious guy. He's like, hey, listen, we all belong, we all have a place, and so forth. So, this also goes to the idea of, like, again, you have to look at Jewish history in the context of the larger history that's going on. The Polish Catholic Church is seeing itself as being sort of needing to defend against modernity, against orthodoxy, as in Eastern Orthodoxy, against challenges to Catholic identity. And when you look at how many of these things, again, there's a great statement by American writer. It's going to come to me as soon as this is over. But it refers to anti-Semitism as sort of protean bigotry, right? Whatever you dislike, you can find in Jews. So from the perspective of the Catholic Church, right? There's the place the Jews have in Christianity. But there's also the place Jews have perhaps as agents of modernity, right? There's also the role of Jews as agents of socialism. There's the role the Jews have as agents of either the German authorities or the Russian authorities, or whatever it may be. So the Catholic Church does become pretty openly anti-Jewish, and again ties in with this sort of growth in nationalism, which may be a long answer, but I hope that addresses some of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It is interesting, by the way. I want to say that because this would be something for a later class, but there's a famous speech made by one of the prominent Polish Catholic leaders in like the 1930s, where he seems to be criticizing the Jews, and this becomes one of these sort of debates, like in Polish and Jewish historiography. Slavic languages don't have articles, right? There's no definite articles. There's no the or a. So you'll have sometimes these statements in which you can look at it as, is this guy saying the Jews are a threat to Poland, or Jews are a threat to Poland, right? Which if you're a Jew might not be that, in Poland might not be that much of a difference, but in terms of what the guy's saying could actually be fairly significant. But yeah, the Catholic Church in Poland was a bulwark of that kind of right-wing nationalism. Anyone else? Gary, were you saying something before? No? All right. So if should I take that ringing as a sign that class is over? Is that the bell? All right. I bleed Eder, but I promised next week to start on time. So I'm very sorry about that. But take care.
Thank you very much.
Kol Tuv. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you.